Hello.
I know all these people.
Hey, it's Natalie.
Hi, Andy.
Hi,
Hi,
Natalie.
Lindsay. Hi, little bear.
No, there's Steve Weber.
I know Steve too. Yay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay! Great. Hey, guys. Hey, Andy.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm Erin tonight.
You're Erin. Great. And Natalie's here. Hey, Lindsay. We haven't met yet, I don't think.
No,
How are you? And who's this?
this is Connor.
Hi, Connor.
Well, I need to use my headphones. Just be right back.
Okay.
I like it. Yeah.
Connor just turned 4.
Oh, my gosh. Well, that's like super exciting. I like that you have help there, Lindsay.
Yes, we do.
Can you guys can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Natalie taught me about recording on Zoom, so I think I'm doing that, Natalie.
Yes, I can see that you're recording.
Great. Steve's here. Hey, Steve. How are you? Okay, so before we start, if you guys have a second to think a little bit about questions that you have specifically that I might be able to answer, I'd love to be able to make sure that you come out of this webinar having your questions answered. If not, you're totally welcome to sit and enjoy the ride because I have a lot of things to just talk about. But feel free to I'm turning chat on so you can type your messages there and your questions, and I will be happy to pause and answer your questions. Hey, Karen. Erin, can you hear me? All right, and Nick's here. Hey, Nick.
Hello.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. As you guys can see, I'm coming in from the hospital, and I don't know how great the Wi-Fi is, and so if something happens, I'll just jump back on. Sometimes it kicks me off, so sorry for any technological glitches that we have. It's pretty good.
Okay?
Yeah, I'm admitted to the hospital with a baby, but my still working, so we are still on fighting. Okay, so it is 6 o'clock, and I'm sure, what was that, Karen?
Did you have the baby?
I did not yet. We are settling in for, well, since it's 6 o'clock, let me tell you guys, welcome to this webinar. Different than usual, I usually would be meeting you guys from my office. However, on this weekend, I was admitted to the hospital with eclampsia, so pre-eclampsia. So I am in the hospital with the baby. Baby hasn't come yet, but we're just going to be here for a couple weeks. So I'm still working as usual, and so you can reach me via email. But it is possible that nurses will come in here. You're going to hear some like hospital type noises in the background. I might have to stop, but we're not going to let that stop us because I have a lot of great things to talk about. So if you're just joining us, I turned the chat on, and hopefully you guys can all see that on the right side of your screen. If you have questions about something I'm talking about, please type your question in that bar, and then I will pause and we'll answer questions. The most important thing for me is that you guys come out of this with some great sales and marketing persuasion tips that you can start using right away. Cool. Also, this is being recorded. For people who couldn't make it, they requested recording. So, all right, let's get started here. Okay, so as you guys know, I'm Micah Larsen, Rogue Persuasion Scientist. And what does that really mean? Well, I used to do research on the brain and the best ways to get people to buy into things like becoming an organ donor or not doing meth or not driving while they're drunk or talking about their breast cancer diagnoses. And then I decided to leave academia to teach people like you guys how to use really great persuasion in your marketing and your sales, because the science still applies. I started my company, APIS, Communication Science, so that I could kind of be my own boss and take the lead on making all these great decisions. And that's how I met so many of you great entrepreneurs as well. So I think we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience here. So I'll kind of gear what I'm talking about towards you guys. Sound good? Okay. Again, I'm in the hospital, so if Wi-Fi slows down, that's probably why. Okay, now let's just start with getting everyone on the same page about a definition of persuasion. So persuasion is simply the process of changing people's attitudes so that we can change their behavior. And we can even envision people's attitudes as like, if we are standing in a room, there's one big ball in the middle of the room that is our self-concept, and the entire room is just filled with marbles kind of floating in the air that are our attitudes. And the things that are really important to us would be marbles that are floating really close to our self-concept. The things that are less important to us would be floating far away. And the process of persuasion is like moving those marbles around so that we can make things more important to our persuasion targets. The more important, the more positive our attitudes are towards something, the more likely we are to buy into them. So the persuasion I'm talking about tonight is a subtle set of tactics that you can use in your marketing, in your sales, in your emails, in your conversations, and your pitches. What we're doing is moving people's attitudes around so that when you make requests of them in your marketing and your sales, they're going to be more likely to say yes. So there are 4 parts of persuasion that we kind of have to understand to know how to use this really well. First, there's you, the persuader. And you're coming from a certain perspective and you have certain goals. And you have a lot of characteristics yourself, your gender, your background, your education. A lot of persuasion tactics are about kind of changing those things to make you a better persuader yourself. Number 2 is your target, or the person you would like to persuade. And we can say targets too, because we aren't always just trying to persuade one person in a one-on-one conversation. Often we're trying to persuade the mass audience, like when we run an ad campaign, or we're trying to persuade all the people who look at our social media page. So targets can be a small group of people. It can be your team, your sales team. It could be your family. It could be the general public. The third part of persuasion is your request, or what you would like your targets to buy into. What do you want them to say yes to? And this can be anything. It could be like what my published research was on was how to have good intimate relationships. So how can we get people to say yes to having good conversations about intimate relationships? Or it could be come to my workshop next week, or try a sample of my product, or say yes to my proposal, let me build your website. Your requests can be a lot of different things. So just take a second right now, if you have pencil and paper in front of you, and just identify who your target is, or who your targets are, and what your request is. So your target, who you'd like to persuade, and your request, or what you would like him or her to buy into. Cool. All right, the 4th part of persuasion is the tactic. So this is my game. This is what I do. I develop, based on decades of research, easy persuasion tactics that we can use to make it more likely that when we do make our request, our targets are primed to say yes. So this is really important because persuasion is a process. It's not like I could walk into a room and immediately get people to say yes to something, though I would be able to increase the likelihood that they sure would. Persuasion is all about spending time using tactics before you make a request. So how many of you guys, and if you can raise your hand, or if your audio is on, you can say me, how many of you are uncomfortable with kind of walking into a situation and doing a hard sell? Like walking in and trying to aggressively try to sell something. Me too. I used to work at Victoria's Secret, and I was like terrible at that. Victoria's Secret's not a great place for a hard sell anyway. I find that most people are uncomfortable with kind of acting the salesperson. So persuasion is a really great way to avoid ever having to pitch or sell something, because if you use persuasion tactics up until a request, then you're never going to have to act like a salesperson, and they're very subtle, and you will be much more likely to get a yes by the time you make that request. The idea is that we subtly expose our targets to persuasion tactics so that when we make that request, they will buy in. So obviously subtlety is important. People don't like to be sold to. We tend to have like a reaction against that. People want to be able to make their own choices. So that's why we keep these persuasion tactics very subtle. So right now, here are some examples of how some of my real life clients are using persuasion tactics. I have a friend who is like the most genius marketing director that I know, but she came to me for help creating an online campaign to get people on the internet to attend a webinar kind of like this one for a really famous speaker client that she has in the southeastern United States. And so she has a lot of data about what these people on Facebook like about the speaker. And he's trying to catch their email addresses by getting them to sign up for a webinar. So there are a couple of tactics that I am having her use in her ad campaigns, and it's just little subtle changes that she's making to this Facebook ad that she's running to incentivize people and make them feel like they are similar to the speaker, that will motivate them to buy into this request, which is sign up for the webinar. Second, I have a friend who's a consultant and entrepreneur. He has a great background in sales, but he wanted some advice about how to improve this brochure that he's using to get people interested in his services when he goes to conferences. And we talked about how to use the fluency tactic. So when you look at this brochure, it's a lot more fluent on the eyes, and it doesn't make the person reading it feel like they have a lot of work to do, and it's easy to understand. And so these are some tactics that I am going to, oh, Andy's also uncomfortable in Victoria's Secret. I get that. I didn't see a lot of men who look comfortable in Victoria's Secret. So I'm going to explain what these tactics are, but I want to give you some real life examples about how some of my clients are using the persuasion tactics that we'll cover tonight. Okay, so let's start with a really easy, basic persuasion tactic called the consistency tactic. So maybe this is something that you have noticed about yourself, that you are very motivated to be consistent. And what I mean by this is that you like to practice what you preach because you know that other people will like that about you. You like to act in a way that aligns and is consistent with your attitudes and your beliefs, because it's very uncomfortable to think one way and act another, right? And you like when the world is easy to predict. You like when things are consistent and your world lines up with the way you want to see it. Consistency is really super socially desirable. We have really high expectations for other people to be consistent, and we have high expectations for ourselves to be consistent. And this is because our brains are designed to always use the least amount of energy as possible. Our brains run on glucose. So if your brain is like a car, glucose is like the gas, and our cars always want to be on that kind of cruise control. So when our world is consistent, our brains can be on cruise control and they can just kind of run low energy. The consistency tactic is when we use that really strong desire and motivation that people have for consistency and make it more likely that they will buy into our requests. So it's something that's already within us. We just kind of use that motivation to drive them to buy in. So there are two steps to this, the consistency tactic. First is commitment, and second is giving our targets an opportunity to be consistent with that commitment. So first, we ask people to take a step, and then we give them the opportunity to continue making steps in that direction. And I'm gonna give you an example. Here's one of my favorite classic examples from social influence research. So during the Korean War, there were American prisoners of war who were taken into Chinese prison camps. And these prisoners of war, of course, were total patriots, and they were taken into the prison camps, and their captors actually used the consistency tactics on them to get them to give up the locations of their fellow American soldiers, which you'd think was, they must have tortured these guys to get them to do so, but that wasn't the case. They actually just had, the Chinese captors had the prisoners of war make a a series of small consistent steps, so that by the time they asked these prisoners of war to give up the soldiers' locations, they were willing to do it. So first, they asked the soldiers to do that step one of this tactic, make a small commitment. Just say, America is not the best country in the world. Soldiers did that. They're prisoners of war. They don't have a lot of agency. Okay, this seemed like no big deal. Second, they asked the prisoners of war, now you've done that, now let's act consistently again. Now just say that out loud to a group. America is not the best country in the world. Democracy might be kind of flawed. So the soldiers have taken these steps. They can act consistently even further when they were asked to write down America is not the best country in the world. And then eventually they were asked to talk about it on the Chinese radio. And so after taking all these steps, acting consistently, when the soldiers were finally asked to give up the location of their scouts and their American troops, it didn't seem like such a leap. And they did this without laying a hand on these prisoners of war. And so this is a really, really drastic example, but we can see how leading people in a series of small yeses, we're driven to be consistent, even if it's something that we don't believe. So we know that there are two steps of the consistency tactic: commitment and an opportunity to remain consistent. There are also two types of commitments. You can remind people of an existing commitment that they already made. So reminding targets of their past commitments, you can, like if you were asking someone to come to one of your events, you might remind him or her of a statement or a commitment that he or she made, like saying something like, did you make a New Year's resolution about professional development? Say that you worked in a professional development field. And then when you give him or her the opportunity to act consistently, you could say something like, now here's a good way to make good on that resolution. So step one, remind your target of the past commitment that they made, and then give him or her an opportunity to act consistently with it. Nick says, I get almost all of my work from word of mouth. Consistency is critical to his success. Absolutely. This is related. Consistency is a great way to get people to be really brand loyal. If you ask people who buy products to refer that product to someone else, they'll tend to be more engaged in it because we want to be consistent with our attitudes and actions. So that has a lot to do with word of mouth referrals. Referrals actually work as a consistency tactic. So here's some examples of that. When we ask online survey participants to think back about the good deeds and how they've helped other people over the past few months, then when they're given the opportunity to donate to a good cause, like a fund for earthquake survivors, they're 3.5 times more likely to donate. So we remind people of an action or an attitude, and then when we give them that opportunity to be consistent, they're much more likely to do so. So can you, in your work, when you're asking people to buy in and you're marketing your sales, can you ask your target to think about times that he or she was involved, determined, ready to invest in something smart, adventurous? What kind of words, what kind of actions or beliefs have to do with your requests? Like Andy works in marketing, so he would want a commitment from someone who was ready to engage in a creative process or really appreciated savvy digital marketing. So you might think about what kind of actions and attitudes have to do with really great digital marketing, and remind people of times that they might have appreciated good marketing or good ads. When you give them the opportunity to remain consistent with that, they'll be more likely to do so. Okay, so we know that we can use, oh yeah, Andy.
I'm wondering, can that consistency also apply to like their competitors? So if I were to say something like, well, your competitors are doing this and it would be consistent for you to do it too, right? So if everyone else is running Google ads, you know, you can maybe point that out and they would be like, well, I want to be consistent with others in my industry. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's actually the social proof tactic too. So we like to go with the herd, and it is a strong persuasive tactic to show people what their peers are doing, and especially you can give people examples of most similar to that. So you're exactly right. It's not even the consistency tactic, it's the social proof tactic. Like my internet wobbled there. Can you hear me? Okay, so yes. To answer your question, again, everyone, that is an example of the social proof tactic. We're really persuaded by what other people we consider similar to ourselves are doing. So if Andy were to say, I see a lot of your competitors in your industry using Google ads, then we want to be part of the herd, right? And I would specifically give examples of competitors who are most similar to your target. Awesome. Okay, so we know we can use existing commitments. We can also have people make new commitments. So if you can have your target make a new commitment about have a great attitude or make an action, and then ask him to act consistently with it, you could ask people to make honesty pledges. So industry research suggests that signing something in the beginning of a task does make people more honest throughout the rest of the task. And for example, industry research has been done in auto insurance companies, and people tend to misreport odometer readings a lot less when they sign an honesty pledge at the beginning. And so this is like a really very, very simple step we can take, and it is the consistency tactic. But if you work in an industry where you have trouble with people complying with you, or they don't really have good follow through, just consider it doesn't have to be a really fancy contract, but just the act of writing a concrete pledge and signing your name to it beforehand does make it more likely that people will buy in and follow through. Even just asking people to, yeah.
Well, if you want to finish your thought, I don't want to interrupt.
Nope, go ahead. It's great time.
I just wanted to add, if that's okay, that when with our sales force, you know, when we are consistent in the approach that we take, you know, with using permission-based language, getting someone to take a little step and then getting them to take another little step, it also helps us as the people who are selling to feel more confident, because what we're saying is more fluid because we are being consistent.
Yes, and you like to feel like you're acting consistently too. As much as we have high expectations for other people to act consistently, we have even higher expectations for ourselves to be consistent. And if you've ever hung out with someone who had an inconsistent behavior, you know how awful that can be. And when we're inconsistent in our own actions, it gives us that feeling of cognitive dissonance, where we're saying one thing and doing another. And that's what a lot of people who work in sales industries and uncomfortable dislike about their jobs. Now, you don't work in that type of industry, but people who've had bad experiences in sales do feel that way. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. That's a really great point. So here's another easy way to use the consistency tactic by getting people to make new commitments. If you want people to show up for some kind of event or meeting, instead of just saying, well, I'm going to mark you as coming to this event, ask them to make some kind of verbal commitment by saying, I will mark you as coming. Is that okay? And actually wait for a response, because you have to just make a little verbal commitment. Even that small nudge can make them and tends to make them more likely to follow through. Services organizations, industry research showed that people who run blood donation banks have used this tactic and raised participation in their blood drives from 70 to about 80%. So another really easy way to use the consistency tactic. All right. Any questions about consistency and commitment? Remember the 2 steps. Ask people to make a commitment or remind them of a commitment, and then give them an opportunity to remain consistent with it. I'm on a lot of drugs right now, so I'm not making sense. Let me know. Stop me. So, good. Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Okay, I want to move on to one of my favorite tactics. It's called the co-creation tactic. And I just had a great workshop with a organization in Missoula where we got really into the topic of co-creation. So how many of you guys have ever like done a DIY project and it maybe didn't turn out looking like it did on Pinterest, but you felt really like you valued it a lot? Because I have. I made a pie for my husband's birthday. It looked so terrible, but I made the crust myself. And so I felt like very in love with this pie, even though it looked like dirt. It still tasted good. What I'm talking about is that we tend to have this affinity and close affection for the things that we create ourselves, because evolutionarily it benefits us to find value and to find value in the things that we've invested our time and energy in. So our brains are just built to overvalue the things that we have created and even expect other people to overvalue them as well. So here's an example. Imagine that I asked you to come into a room and fold some origami. So maybe you've never done origami before. I know I'm not very good at origami. And I say it doesn't matter how good it is, but when you have sat for an hour and you folded origami of whatever mediocre value, you can buy it back from me. I just want you to write down the maximum amount of money that you're willing to pay for your own kind of terrible origami. So researchers actually did this experiment. Nick Salmon, I bet you know what I'm talking about. Dan Ariely experiment. What the researchers found is that the people who created their own origami were willing to pay 5 times more for it than people who just were asked to buy the origami. And this has been replicated in several different areas. What I'm talking about is something called the IKEA effect. And if you ever shopped at IKEA, which I did for the first time this year, you know that you go up to this fancy, beautiful setup and you see all this beautiful furniture, and then when you want to buy it, you go down to the basement and you have to get the box and put all the pieces together. So there's like a lot of work involved, and I'm not particularly good at putting things together. So for me, it takes a while. Me, like a lot of other people, I will tend to end up valuing that piece of mediocre furniture that I put together much more than if I just bought it off the shelf, because I've invested in it. So the IKEA effect has been studied over many years, and what we know about it is that we tend to overvalue the things we make. We tend to think that other people will tend to value it more. So when we try to persuade people, if we give them the opportunity to create something as part of our request, then they'll be much more likely to buy into it. Because if we can get people to sink a little bit of their energy or mental capacity into some kind of project, when we ask them to buy into it later on, they'll be much more likely to say yes. So this can be anything from getting on the Nike website and customizing a pair of tennis shoes. Or do you know how much money people are willing to pay for M&Ms that they customize with their own names on it? It's absurd. If we have put some kind of thought or effort or customization into something, we'll pay out the wazoo for it. But this actually happens in management too. It doesn't need to be a product necessarily. So research shows us that when managers are really involved in working on projects, they tend to value them more. They tend to think that they have a bigger role and responsibility in creating it, and they tend to rate the projects at the end 50% better. They also, Natalie said she made custom M&Ms for a wedding and you paid a lot. I don't blame you. It's cool. It's fun, right? And those managers also felt like they have even more control over their employees. So we tend to find a lot of value and we look for the best things and best qualities in the things that we have created. So we can use the co-creation tactic, like I said, to get people to put a little bit of energy and thought into a project. So when we ask them to buy into it later, they'll be much more likely to buy in. So there are 2 steps. Ask your targets to get involved in something related to your request. And when you make your request, they'll be more likely to say yes again. Oh my gosh, Lindsay also made custom M&Ms. So Nick says he's thinking of how to have a potential client co-create with something as part of a project interview, which is brilliant. And Nick is a consultant and he travels around helping school districts create better ways to teach by designing their classrooms in a smart way. And so there's a lot of personalization that happens in his job. So I think that that would be brilliant for his industry, but I bet we could all think of ways that we could do this in our jobs. Okay, so it's good to remember that it does not have to be a significant contribution that you're asking for your target to make. It could just be their advice. It could be their feelings. It could be their input. Natalie's asking, she's curious about how to co-create with potential leaders to make a greater to get a greater commitment. Natalie, can you tell me more about the commitment that you're trying to get?
Sometimes I forget where the unmute is. So we have people on our team who begin selling and growing, and then sometimes they hit this wall, and we have lots of tools to help them to get beyond that and to keep going. But I'm curious about how we could use co-create, and maybe I've answered my own question, like involving them and collaboration to create something for supporting our user group is probably a good example. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think a lot of times as leaders, I know you're a great leader and you're great at developing leaders. As a leader, we tend to think, well, I'm going to come up with a plan to get people to get over this hump that you're having. However, it might be beneficial to ask the group to come together and come up with a set of strategies, and you can lead the group. But if you make it into a group conversation and a group effort where they make input on how they can solve their own problems, that they'll be more likely to follow through and actually take those actionable steps. Does that make sense? Nick says, Natalie, I have a series of team formation, team decision-making exercises that might be helpful. And I've actually seen Nick's awesome, it's like a deck of cards where you go through exercises about making decisions as a team. And it is absolutely fascinating. And I've studied decision science and group decision making, and it's really legit. So Nick and Natalie might be a great connection for you. Okay, so most of you guys live in Missoula, right? Not all of you. The Missoula Downtown Association is actually using the co-creation tactic in this brilliant way right now, because have you seen them inviting everybody to come down and make choices about the future of Missoula's downtown? I know some people who've gone to those meetings. So it doesn't matter what we do in those meetings, if we just kind of stand there or we drink coffee or we raise our hands and voice our opinions. Just being involved in something like that, anyone who attends those meetings will be much more likely to buy in when there are requests made of them having to do with the Missoula downtown in the future, because they feel like they've been a part of that process and they've co-created, even if it's in a really, really passive way. So remember, you don't have to ask people to come up with a whole plan as part of your co-creation. Beth, when you design websites, having people be involved as a part of the process may make it more likely that they're willing to pay on time, or I don't know, what is your experience with that, if you want to share or not?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I have been working towards stepping out of the website business.
Okay.
And I'm launching Missoula Mini Golf right now.
Whoa, Beth, that's so cool.
Super excited. I've been wanting to do this for a while. And part of the vision, this is like perfect tactic. I just naturally decided it needs to have 2 courses. One is all Missoula holes indoors. So like the carousel is a hole and the M is a hole and Brennan's Wave and stuff like that.
That is so cool.
And the outdoor course is all around Montana. So it's like Glacier and Yellowstone and Butte. And I mean, there's way more than 18 awesome things about Missoula and way more than 18 awesome things about Montana. So part of getting everybody psyched for this, part of my marketing is to have like a vote for what holes we're gonna have.
Exactly. Okay, this is such a great example. And this is a great tactic to use when you're launching some kind of new product or you have some kind of new opportunity for people, because just giving input, even if it isn't significant change making input, even if you don't use the input, people are more likely to be interested and follow up. And so like a Facebook poll or whatever, Beth, that's amazing. I'm super excited for you. And
Thank
like
you.
what is a simple way to use this tactic, right? They're gonna be more likely to pay attention to your ads forever after you ask them to vote.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited. I'm pitching actually at Missoula Soup on Thursday.
Oh my
next
gosh.
week. Yeah.
Good luck.
So I'm going to be connecting with you some more, I'm sure.
Yes, please do.
Okay, I really need to start getting good at persuading, because like working at this software company, we had people, come into the doors a lot and a lot of referral work. And it was always people just already wanted the business and wanted to do what they wanted to do. So,
well,
and I don't want to hog up the last few minutes. It looks like we're getting you done. So
no, I'm going to go till 7.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah,
I might have to leave. I was thinking 7 at first, and then I was like, oh no, it only goes to 6:30.
Well, I put that because I'm in the hospital and I didn't know how long I was going to be able to talk, but I'm being optimistic. I'm going till 7. I feel good. I'm just a little bit sweaty, so it's fine.
I'm going to come back and dip into the video of it because,
Okay, awesome. Beth, I'm really excited for you. That's awesome.
Thank you.
So that's a great example about how upcoming, even an existing product, if you're going to make any updates to it, ask your targets as a group or target to give some kind of advice or insight into how to change it or update it, and you're going to be more likely to get buy-in later on. This is something I talked about with that group from Luminad, and they realized that they had been doing this kind of silly, they thought it was silly, contest type thing where they had 4 Harry Potter houses and divided up all their people into these houses, and they were awarded points for doing like good job at their work, and they all got really competitive about it. And it was just kind of having people get involved in this and co-creating something together, which was this Harry Potter experience, got people much more invested, and they were all like a lot more productive in their work. So even though it was kind of silly. Oh, Beth is going to dip back in this video. She said so she can see Nick's comment about how the holes can change over time, like on a golf course. That would be awesome. Okay, so do we have any questions?
I will say yes, there's going to be several of the holes that will be changing each year, like one for each school. I planned on having like school spirit happening in there, so the school hole would always be different, and
it's a great opportunity to have people continually invested in the co-creation, because just taking suggestions. Here's the example I was trying to think of. Does anyone remember Bodie McBoatface, which was actually a boat that was like in Canada? I think I would have to Google it. Okay, so there's like a government shipping vessel or tugboat, I think in Vancouver or something, that was going to be sent out to do its job in the UK. Nick says in the UK. Thanks, Nick. Fact checking me. And they put out like a public request for what this boat's name would be, and someone suggested Bodie McBoatface and made it into a public poll, and that's what the UK voted, that this boat's name should be. The most ridiculous name, literally Bodie McBoatface. And it is like a pretty boring topic, just like a government boat that goes out and I don't know, rescues other boats in the harbor. But now it's like this really famous boat and people follow it on Twitter or whatever because they just cast a vote in an online poll about what this boat's name should be, right? And so now if people are trying to raise money or make a request or persuade people to be invested in the boat, you would better believe that anyone who voted in that poll would be much more likely to do so. Awesome. Cool. Okay, bye, Beth. Thanks for stopping by. Anyone have any questions about the co-creation tactic? If you have questions about how you can use it, please drop them in the comments or speak up, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Nick says, just listen to Hidden Brain. Love that podcast by NPR about laughter today. Interesting bonds formed between people via laughter. That's super interesting. Here's an interesting side topic having to do with this. Our brains all have something called mirror neurons. So we have evolved to be able to connect with people very efficiently by just looking at them and seeing other people's emotions on their faces. Like when we see other people laughing, that turns on mirror neurons in our brains that help us to experience the same emotions that other people are feeling. So mirror neurons actually help us empathize with others and kind of connect with their emotions. I love the way that mirror neurons were discovered. It has to do with monkeys and ice cream. So there were some graduate students who actually were keeping a monkey in a lab for testing, which is really sad. And this was quite a number of years ago. So it's not happening in 2019. And they had this monkey hooked up to monitors that would beep when he was making movements with his hands and his face, or thinking about his hands and his face. So it was plugged into his brain. And they found that when they came back into the lab after lunch and were eating ice cream in front of this monkey, that when they lifted their ice cream to their face to lick it, the monkey's brain would start activating in the parts of his brain that had to do with using his mouth. So they could see that when he watched other people eat ice cream, this monkey was experiencing the same kind of feeling as eating ice cream. So that's how mirror neurons were discovered. Kind of a tangent. What mirror neurons tell us is that we're really affected by other people's emotions, and so visualizing and seeing how other people are experiencing emotions through their faces can be very persuasive. We can talk about that more. I suggest everyone check out the Hidden Brain podcast. It's on NPR and it's fantastic, and they talk about a lot of social influence research, even though they don't call it persuasion. It's really fantastic. You learn a lot. Thanks, Steve, polling the target audience to put input on a future product. And you did that recently, Steve, on your Facebook page with your website. So you already are using that tactic. It's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm going to move.
There's a lot more to come. So I feel like I can just keep going with that survey thing.
Yes, it's great. And like once you make one decision, just keep asking for input, and people, once they buy in that first time, they're going to be more likely to continue doing so.
Do you know
awesome.
if you poll in LinkedIn, or does that not work anymore? Polling in LinkedIn, do you know?
I don't know. I haven't done a poll on LinkedIn.
Okay.
That's a good question. Anyone else really good at LinkedIn on here? Chime in, type in the chat for Steve about polling on LinkedIn. Awesome. Okay. So let's talk about another really cool tactic called the incentive tactic. So Natalie asked a question of me and emailed me a question earlier, which was awesome. And she was wondering, and this applies to any of us who work with other people, or as to any of us who work in sales, when we're avoiding making a sales call because we are afraid of being rejected. How many of us have done that? Like avoiding going and meeting someone and sitting down for coffee because you kind of want them to buy into an idea. And it's really scary. And I know that I've experienced that, like when I first started my company, and I would just get like really sweaty, and I would think about how can I skip this meeting because I'm getting kind of nervous about it. And if we are able to opt out sometimes of making those kinds of sales calls, or those meetings will often kind of skip it. So how can we persuade ourselves to make those calls and step out of our box? And, as much as I talk about persuading other people, there are so many ways to persuade ourselves. And one of them is using the incentive tactic. Well, my first answer is something called the directed attention tactic. We know that our brains are biased, that when we focus our attention on something, we tend to think that it's like the most important thing going on in our environment. This is because our brains have evolved to really focus their energy and attention on one thing, and we're actually pretty bad at multitasking. So before you go and you are going to put yourself out of your box and make this sales call, I suggest making a list of things that you've done successfully in the past month or 6 months. We know that what you focus on your attention on is what you tend to value. So you will tend to build your confidence up if you're directing your attention and really focusing on successes that you've had in the past month. So what other sales calls have you had that went well? It can be things completely unrelated to sales, like what have you done that's for someone else in the last month? What small successes have you had? Have you paid back part of a loan? Have you made a really good presentation? Focused attention, that's basically pretty much the basis of persuasion. Persuasion is all about arranging people's attention and getting them to focus on one thing rather than the other. And things can really start to snowball when we focus on the negative instead of the positive. This is something that I'm making videos about, actually, about my experience being in the hospital so far. I'm persuading myself to stay really positive. Natalie, I was telling you about this. By focusing on, I'm making a list of all the silver linings about me living in a hospital for like a month, because I need to persuade myself to stay in good spirits and be a really good patient. And it matters where I direct my attention. Okay, the second answer to Natalie's question was the incentive tactic, which I'd like to talk about next. So we can use incentives to motivate ourselves, and we can motivate other people. First, I'm going to talk about motivating ourselves with incentives. So there are two types of incentives. And in this situation, when you're trying to persuade yourself to make a sales call, even though you're afraid of rejection, you can motivate yourself with an immediate extrinsic reward. The two types of incentives are intrinsic, or things that kind of make us feel good, like satisfaction, acknowledgement, recognition. And extrinsic rewards are like the material, tangible things, like a free cup of coffee or a gift card or something that we can use in the real world. There are different situations in which we should use these two different types of incentives, but to answer Natalie's question, the best thing to do is to motivate yourself with a reward that you'll get immediately after you make your sales call. And so this could be like, I really want to eat an Oreo, or I'm going to get myself a latte, or I'll take a 1-hour break, or I will do online shopping as soon as I'm done making the sales call. It sounds kind of basic, but persuasion is all about using several tactics to get someone to buy into something. And if that person is you, then I suggest using that directed attention tactic and the incentive tactic. Make that list beforehand of all the things that you've done well in the past month or 3 weeks or 6 months or whatever, and then incentivize you afterwards with an immediate extrinsic reward, something that you're looking forward to. Because our brains are really built to pay attention to rewards, and we crave that dopamine that we get when we reward ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about incentives. All right, so like I said earlier, our attention tends to be really attracted to potential rewards. And this is, you can understand why our brains evolved this way, because we're always kind of looking for resources that can help us survive and do well. And it's a major part of our brains. We haven't grown out of it yet. In our brains, when we get a reward, whether it's that intrinsic reward of like recognition from someone or a shout out on Facebook, or it's something extrinsic like a free cup of coffee or a back rub or something, when we get a reward, we get a shot of dopamine in our brains. And a lot of persuasion research and why we are persuaded comes down to the hormones in our brains, right? but our brains literally get addicted to and are attracted to that dopamine. It's like crack for our brains. And actually, this is why we're so addicted to our phones, because every time you pick up your phone and you see that someone liked your LinkedIn post, or look, someone texted me something nice, then we get a shot of dopamine in our brains. And those notifications and texts over time kind of increase this threshold that we need to keep meeting for our dopamine needs, and we're addicted to it like we would be addicted to sugar or anything else. And we're motivated by the potential rewards even subconsciously. So again, there are these two types of rewards: extrinsic, or material and tangible things, and intrinsic, or these kind of social rewards, like giving someone a compliment or recognition. But they both have a really big impact on our behavior. Here's the difference about when we should use them. We should use intrinsic rewards to motivate people when we want to motivate them for the long term. And we should use extrinsic rewards when we want to motivate people for the short term. So when you think about offering people rewards, it matters what kind you're using. You can offer an extrinsic reward to get people to buy in right away, and then offer them intrinsic rewards to keep getting them to buy in later on. But we know that just having people follow a trail of extrinsic kind of rewards or gifts over time doesn't necessarily work as well. That we tend to be over time more satisfied and feel complete and acknowledged when we're given intrinsic rewards. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those two different types of rewards look like. Okay, so extrinsic rewards, like I said, are material things like candy or money or a free car or a gift that you can give. And we pay attention to these tangible extrinsic rewards for short periods of time. So we have three different types of attention. In general, our brains pay attention in three different ways. There's immediate attention, like when someone says your name in a crowded room and you whip your head around, and that's your immediate attention, and it's kind of like your knee-jerk reaction. There's short-term attention, in which we just pay enough attention to like accomplish a task. And then there's long-term attention, in which we make habits and try to achieve long-term goals. So extrinsic rewards are get good at getting that immediate and short attention. But how we present them matters. So you can get people to buy in the short term, just like attend my webinar or read my email or whatever, by offering that extrinsic reward. But research suggests that it works even better if it's given with an element of surprise. So for example, researchers who watched people on an MRI machine found that when they squirted water or juice into people's mouths, the pleasure centers in their brains lit up a lot more when they got juice and it was a surprise, versus when they knew that it was coming. So, and that extends to all kind of extrinsic rewards that we can give people. And money, this is a caveat about that, is that it is most often the most expensive way, literally, to motivate people, and it's not always the most effective. Instead, we can incentivize people extrinsically by making things into a game. Like if anyone's familiar with the McDonald's Monopoly thing, where you like had to keep going to McDonald's and getting like little stickers on the cups to create your full set. That's a really great way to engage people over time with extrinsic rewards, so they keep coming back to get more rewards. You can do random rewards or kind of like a lottery system. That's a way to kind of keep the surprise element of giving extrinsic rewards in your campaigns. Let's move on to intrinsic rewards. So these are a little bit more gray area, right? There are three kinds of intrinsic rewards that you can give people: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So these are the things that we find really rewarding and satisfying in our lives when we have autonomy or independence and someone gives us the ability to make our own choices. Mastery, when we feel like we've done a really good job at something, we've achieved something. And purpose, or we feel like we're adding value. So those are like the real rewards that you can give people to get them to buy in over a long term. We want to give people happiness and the satisfaction of achievement and social recognition. And this can be really simple. So in one of my favorite studies that I talk about all the time, probably because my husband works in the ICU, and so this is close to home for me, and I'm living in a hospital right now, you would be surprised at how few people wash their hands when they work in an ICU. So in New York State, some people dumped a whole bunch of money and asked researchers to come into a hospital ICU and figure out what's the best way to get care providers like nurses and doctors to wash their hands. I shouldn't talk so loud because I'm talking about nurses and they're like right around the corner. To get them to wash their hands before they exited a patient's room. And we all hope that our doctors do this. But they were seeing miserable rates of hand washing. So the researchers were saying, well, surely if they know that someone's watching them, they're going to wash their hands. So they installed cameras, very visible ones, above the hand washing stations. That did nothing to persuade people to wash their hands more. Then they tried the incentive tactic. So what they did is they installed these little digital message boards above the hand washing stations, and they were completely pre-programmed to say things like good work, just like a scroll message that said good work when one of the doctors washed their hands. And then they tried a different type of board that would give them like a point, which is pretty arbitrary for washing their hands. And they increased hand washing by 90%. And not just in that one facility, but they replicated this study in other facilities as well, which has a huge implication for health in a hospital. And we may think that like this is just a really simple minded way to solve a problem, but we get that little shot of dopamine in our brains when we get a point for something or a little piece of recognition. And they weren't getting any real value from that message board, and they knew it was pre-programmed, and they knew that this wasn't a real compliment. It was literally just a computer saying good work to them. But we still get that little shot of dopamine. Our brains like it, and it leads to motivation. So when you want to use this incentive tactic, your first kind of question to yourself is, do you want to motivate your target in the short term to buy in, or is it kind of a long-term habit that you want your target to buy into? Does anyone have strong feelings about which type that they would use? You can type it in the chat. How many of you guys, if you just raise your hands, are interested in intrinsic rewards and how you might get people to buy in the long term? Nick and Natalie. Yeah, Natalie does a lot of leadership development, so I could see that being really important for you. What about extrinsic rewards? Like short-term buy-in? No. Okay. So does anyone want to hash out, and Natalie uses both. Does anyone want to we'll take the next 5 minutes just to kind of hash out an example and solve your problem. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Well, one thing that I have learned over time is that when I work with a school and its community, that people wrap up the visioning and planning effort excited about the future,
mm-hmm.
because it takes so long for that future to arrive, that energy dissipates.
Yes.
And people lose track of things, and what they actually follow through on is radically different, because the community, the school leaders and teachers and even kids keep changing all the time. But the community is what relatively remains consistent. But sometimes the community doesn't feel like they're the holders of the vision.
Mm-hmm.
And so when those other people leave, then they go, oh, well, I guess we're not doing that anymore. What I'm thinking is that if I can provide some of those intrinsic rewards for those that are making that commitment, a little bit like what you were saying about the downtown Missoula thing,
mm-hmm.
I feel invested in this future. Then perhaps they're more likely to hold everyone accountable for that future instead of stepping away and assuming others will do it.
Yeah, because like Nick's work, it requires people voting on bonds and community input. And so it's like a very long-term process compared to a lot of our work. So what if at certain stages you stopped and you say, now let's take a look back and talk about the things that we've mastered and the goals that we have achieved thus far. And you're really giving people that incentive. You're rewarding them for what you have achieved so far. And so they're motivated to take that next step. Steve says, thanking people every time they share a social past would be an example of rewarding their behavior. Thanking people is great. Giving people, we kind of crave social recognition. And Natalie says she uses extrinsic with users and intrinsic with salespeople. So extrinsic does really work well in sales, and when you're in a sales situation, it's kind of a short-term buy-in type thing, because you're not asking people to make a really long-term commitment necessarily. You're asking people to buy a product. Extrinsic rewards do work really well. And this reminds me, Nick is talking about something important, and it's actually called the ASAP effect. So we tend to value rewards much more when we know when they're going to get them immediately after an action than we know that we're going to get them in the future. So we actually would give up more money. Like if someone says, well, I'll give you $500 in 6 months, or I'll give you $50 right now, we don't value those things equally in comparison, like not on the same dollar value. We value that right away, $50 much more heavily, and we overvalue it. So think about you're taking away value from the rewards that you're offering people when you're saying that they're going to have to wait for them. That's another really important facet of talking about extrinsic rewards, as powerful as they are. And I really like the way that research talks about making rewards into a game, because we get those little dopamine shots from even just doing things like answering a poll. When you get on and you're like on my website, when people take my quiz, it's a lot more interesting to click a button over and over than it is to follow a flow chart. If you kind of turn your buy-in process into a very easy, simple game where people get to make choices and like answer things like a quiz or a poll, then you're more likely to get interaction, because just the act of clicking a button and making a choice is a reward in itself. We tend to really value our ability to make choices for ourselves. I would love any questions that anyone has about anything that we've talked about at this point, and I'm happy to stay a couple minutes until we've answered everyone's questions. Again, my goal is that you guys all turn your Zoom off, having at least one thing that you're going to use right away in your sales and marketing. Okay, go ahead, Nick.
I have to go, so I'm going to just share one other thing, because it's a little bit about that $50 today versus $500.
Yes.
It's just another take on that. I found that if you do a little pilot project, which is a way of spanning the distance to the big funded project, if it's delivered by kids and a teacher with $25,000 that you found kicking around in the school budget, that has a greater value to the community than spending $250,000 paying designers and contractors and professionals to come do the work. The community's perception is, wow, look what these kids did with $25,000, whereas the opposite message is, where did you get $250,000 and where did the money go? It doesn't look, that people carry these attitudes in their head. And so sometimes it's just another way of coming about achieving the same result, but in a very positive way, because it's kids and small amounts of money instead of adults and lots of money.
And that's also a co-creation thing too, because I see people from their community and part of the school district making change, and that's super valuable too. So even when members of our own group or unit create something, we tend to value it more too. Like co-creation extends to people in our own groups. That totally makes sense. That's awesome. Okay, bye, Nick. Anyone else have questions? What can I answer for you, or examples I can give you further about what we talked about today? Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Andrew. I would love to hear even if you guys felt like one tactic super resonated with you, which one you're most excited about using. Personally, I love co-creation. I think it's super exciting, and you can be a little bit creative in how you use it. Steve, do you have any tactics that you're super excited about using?
Yeah, I was just typing it in, but I'll just
say
it. I like this idea of a poll or a survey that is very targeted to kind of lead them down a path, and it's easy. So some thought has to be put into it, because once you get them, I mean, you have to try to get them there, but then once you get them there, it has to be, you can't be asking them to fill in a bunch of, fill in the blank type thing. You almost have to. So I really like that idea, though, especially for the idea of a more complex sale, to get them to buy in.
Yeah, and it is that consistency tactic. Like, they've already made a commitment to go through this whole series of little yeses. So by the time you ask them to make a request, they've sunk some energy into it. That's a great example of how we can blend some of these tactics together. So by the time they get to the end of this survey, they're going to be more likely to say yes. That's awesome. Cool. Hey, Melinda. Awesome. Anyone else have a question? Or Andy.
I just want to go back to the first tactic that you mentioned, the consistency one.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a client who I spoke to today who really said, that her managers really want to accomplish these goals and that my services would help them do that. And I sent the proposal off, and her reply was, well, I'm going to forward this and see what they say. My hope is if I get to have a conversation with them, I will first draw out from them, is it true that you want to accomplish these goals, to get them to admit what they're trying to do. And then then they're going to be consistent to say, and we should hire you to help us do it.
Great. That is a perfect example. And think about your wording. Like, you want it to come out very conversational, right? Like, you don't want them to feel like they're being pressured into anything. Just say, hey, I remember us talking a lot about how you thought that I might be able to help you accomplish your goals. Is that true? And it's totally okay to kind of practice it beforehand and just make sure that you feel like it comes off really conversationally. We tend to have a bad reaction when we think we are being persuaded. So that we try to blend these subtle tactics into our conversations. And that is a great example of how to use it. That's fantastic. Awesome. Okay. All right. So it is 7:03. Thank you guys so much for joining this very unique webinar that I've been hosting here. I'm planning on actually doing these once a month now. If you liked this and thought that this was helpful, you guys have taken a huge step in learning about persuasion and how you can use it in your sales and marketing. So we can return and come back as a group next month and kind of build on what we've already learned together, because I have 100 tactics, and I think we talked about 3 tonight, and we can talk about how you can use the ones you're currently using, and you reminded me which ones you're using and how you've used it, and we can talk about like what's the next step and how can we build on what you're currently using from this webinar. Next month, I hope that I'll have a baby and not be in the hospital. My due date was March 20th. Now it is February 6th. So baby's coming 6 weeks early. Sounds like we're going to try to hang in there. That's why I'm in the hospital. I have severe preeclampsia. So Natalie actually is an amazing angel, and she came and visited me yesterday, and she brought me some popcorn that I ate a lot of. So, and to all of you guys, you amazing Missoula community, I'm so glad to be connected with you. And I really look forward to doing this more with you guys. Remember that I have the Persuasion Pollination blog and my YouTube channel where I upload a lot of free content all the time. And I give out codes for videos that are for free videos in my Persuasion Pollination program at the end of those videos. So I'll still be recording those from here in my lovely hospital room for the next couple weeks. So keep up with the free content. Cool. If you have any questions about what we talked about tonight, please don't hesitate to send me an email. Thanks for joining, guys. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.